I was 32 years old when I finally understood that love and manipulation could look exactly the same, especially when wrapped in Christmas traditions and tied with the ribbon of family obligation. For 3 decades, I had confused being needed with being loved, confused my usefulness with my worth. Before I share what happened that changed everything, let me ask you something that might feel uncomfortably familiar. Have you ever felt completely invisible to your family unless they needed something from you? If that question made your chest tighten with recognition, you're not alone, and this story is for you. I used to believe that being the dependable one, the one who never said no, the one who always showed up, made me valuable to my family. I was wrong about almost everything I thought I knew about love boundaries and what it really means to stand up for yourself. What I discovered changed not just my relationship with my family, but my entire understanding of who I was allowed to be in this world. And it all started with the most terrifying word in the English language, no. But let me start from the beginning, because understanding how I got to that breaking point requires knowing the family I was born into. Working as a freelance graphic designer from my converted garage studio in Westchester County, New York, I pulled in around $65,000 a year creating brand identities for small businesses, not Fortune 500 money, but enough to pay my mortgage fund, my coffee addiction, and occasionally treat myself to something nice. What I hadn't figured out was how to make my family understand that working from home didn't mean I was perpetually available to solve their problems. The Hayes family dynamics were established long before I could walk. Stephanie, my older sister by 3 years, emerged as the golden child from birth. While I was still learning to tie my shoes, she was already captain of her soccer team, president of the student council, and somehow managed to maintain a 4.0 GPA. Mom and Dad, Carol and Bob Hayes, former teacher and retired engineer respectively, beamed with pride whenever anyone mentioned their accomplished firstborn. I learned early that my role was different. When Stephanie had too much homework, guess who helped with her science project? When she wanted to hang out with friends but had promised to clean her room, suddenly Victoria became the responsible one who should handle it. When she forgot about a commitment, there was always understanding Victoria to step in and keep the peace. The worst part wasn't even the extra work. It was the way our parents framed it as natural, inevitable, even virtuous. Family helps family, they would say. Stephanie has so much on her plate. You're so good with these things, Victoria. They made my compliance sound like a character strength rather than what it actually was, the survival strategy of a child who learned that keeping everyone else happy was the only way to avoid conflict. Now, at 35, Stephanie had transformed her childhood entitlement into a full-blown lifestyle. As marketing director at Morrison & Associates, she commanded a salary of $180,000. She lived in a pristine colonial in Scarsdale with her husband, Brad, a real estate agent who specialized in luxury properties, and their 3 children, Chloe, 9, Tyler, 7, and Lily, 4. From the outside, they looked like the American dream personified. The problem was that Stephanie still operated under the assumption that my time belonged to her. Victoria emergency at work, dropping kids in 20 minutes. Not a question, not a request for a favor. A notification of what was about to happen to my afternoon. Victoria, Brad has a showing. Can you take kids this afternoon? The phrasing made it sound like a question, but we both knew it wasn't. These weren't conversations. They were announcements disguised as communication. I loved my nieces and nephew with a fierce protectiveness that surprised me. Sometimes, Chloe had inherited Hayes' curiosity and would spend hours asking me about design principles, color theory, and why some logos worked while others didn't. Tyler possessed an engineer's mind like his grandfather, building elaborate structures out of anything he could find. Lily was pure joy in motion, a tiny person who approached the world with the confidence that everyone would love her as much as I did. But loving them didn't mean I should automatically be available whenever. Stephanie decided she needed help. Emergency childcare, she called it, as if every situation in her well-organized life qualified as an emergency. The real emergency was that she had never learned to hear the word no. My parents, now 58 and 61 respectively, continued their lifelong pattern of enabling Stephanie while expecting me to be endlessly flexible. Your sister works so hard, Mom would say, when I occasionally pushed back. She's building her career. These are important years for her. The implication hung in the air like stale perfume. My work wasn't real work. My time wasn't valuable time. My life wasn't important enough to protect. The breaking point should have come months ago, but I kept thinking each incident would be the last. Surely Stephanie would notice how often she relied on me. Surely she would start asking instead of telling. Surely our parents would recognize the pattern and say something. Instead, the pattern intensified. The moment that finally cracked something inside me happened 3 weeks ago, during Stephanie and Brad's anniversary weekend. I had been looking forward to a third date with Marcus, a photographer I'd met at a networking event. We had genuine chemistry, the kind that made me remember why dating could be exciting instead of exhausting. We'd made plans for Saturday night, dinner at a restaurant in White Plains that had been booked solid for months. Friday afternoon, my phone buzzed. Victoria Brad surprised me with a weekend getaway for our anniversary. Dropping kids at your place in an hour? You're a lifesaver. I stared at the message for a full minute, waiting for the follow-up text asking if I was available, acknowledging that this was short notice, expressing some awareness that I might have my own plans. Nothing came. When I called her back, Stephanie was already in the car. "Oh, good. You got my message. We're about 10 minutes away. The kids have already eaten, but Lily might want a snack before bed. Tyler has a soccer game tomorrow at 9, and Chloe needs to finish her book report. You know how they are." I tried to explain about my date, about how long it had taken to get this reservation, about how maybe I wasn't available every single time she needed something. Her response was a laugh that didn't contain any humor. "Victoria, come on. It's not like you're married or anything. You can reschedule. This is our anniversary." So I did what I always did. I called Marcus, canceled our date, and spent Saturday morning at a youth soccer field in Scarsdale instead of waking up in the arms of someone who might actually become important to me. When Stephanie and Brad returned Sunday evening glowing and relaxed, she handed me a generic magnet from their hotel gift shop and said, "The kids were good, right? I knew you could handle it." That night, I pulled out a small notebook and wrote down the date, the cost of my canceled reservation, and the emotional price of being treated like the family's free babysitting service. It was the first entry, but I had a feeling it wouldn't be the last. As I sat in my studio the next morning, surrounded by client projects and the life I'd built for myself, I realized that something fundamental needed to change. I just wasn't sure I had the courage to make it happen. The Marcus incident was my wake-up call, but it took me 2 weeks to actually pick up the phone and call a therapist. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, that family dynamics were complicated, that maybe I just needed to communicate better. But when I found myself crying in my car after canceling yet another plan, because Stephanie needed something, I knew I needed professional help. Dr. Elena Rodriguez had an office in a converted Victorian house in downtown White Plains. Her waiting room smelled like lavender and had the kind of comfortable furniture that made you want to sink in and never leave. When she opened her door that first Tuesday in September, I immediately felt like I could trust her. She was probably mid-40s, with kind eyes and the sort of calm presence that made you believe she'd heard it all before. The first session was mostly me rambling about how I wasn't sure why I was there, how my family wasn't really that bad, how maybe I was just being too sensitive. Dr. Rodriguez listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions that made me think harder about what I was actually saying. By the third session, she'd helped me identify the pattern I'd been living with for 32 years. "Your family has conditioned you to prioritize their needs above your own," she said during one particularly enlightening hour. "They've taught you that your value comes from what you can do for them, not from who you are as a person." The sessions weren't cheap at $150 a week, but they were changing my life in ways I hadn't expected. We did role-playing exercises where I practiced saying no without over-explaining or apologizing. I wrote letters to my family that I would never send, pouring out years of resentment and frustration onto paper. Most importantly, I started identifying my own needs and wants, many of which I'd buried so deep I'd forgotten they existed. The concept of boundaries was revolutionary to me. Dr. Rodriguez explained that setting limits wasn't selfish or mean. It was necessary for healthy relationships. The people who truly cared about me would respect those boundaries. The people who didn't weren't really showing me love anyway. While I was learning about emotional boundaries in therapy, Stephanie was escalating her demands in real life. October brought Halloween, which in the Morrison household was apparently a production requiring extensive family support. Stephanie called me the morning of October 31st with barely contained panic in her voice. "Victoria, I completely forgot Tyler's class party is this afternoon, and I have a presentation I can't miss. Can you take him? They need a parent or guardian to sign him out early." I had a consultation scheduled with a potential client, a boutique hotel chain that could have meant months of steady work. But there was Tyler probably excited about his costume and the party, and there was Stephanie sounding genuinely stressed for once. So I rescheduled my meeting and spent my afternoon in a second-grade classroom, watching 7-year-olds consume their weight in sugar. The client chose a different designer. They needed someone who could accommodate their timeline, they said politely. Someone more flexible. 2 weeks later came the Thanksgiving prep crisis. Our family had always done a big production for the holiday, with Mom cooking for days and everyone contributing something. Stephanie volunteered to bring 3 dishes, then called me the Sunday before. I'm completely swamped with this Morrison and Can you handle the sweet potato casserole green bean dish? And maybe that cranberry sauce Mom loves. I'll pay you back for groceries. She never did pay me back, but more than that, I spent my entire weekend cooking for a family dinner where Stephanie would get credit for bringing beautiful homemade side. When people complimented the food, she smiled and accepted the praise without mentioning my name. The school fundraiser in November was the final straw. Chloe's elementary school was selling raffle tickets for their winter carnival, and each family was expected to sell at least 20 tickets at $5 each. Stephanie dropped off a stack of tickets at my house with a note saying she was too busy with work but knew I'd want to help support Chloe's education. I ended up buying 10 tickets myself and selling the rest to clients and neighbors. When the school newsletter came out thanking families for their participation, the Morrison family was listed as top sellers. My $100 contribution had somehow become Stephanie's charitable generosity. I kept documenting everything in my notebook. The lost client opportunity cost me at least $2,000. The Thanksgiving ingredients cost me $150. The fundraiser tickets, another $100. But the real cost was harder to quantify. How do you put a price on missed opportunities? Canceled dates and the slow erosion of your own sense of worth. I found myself researching vacation rentals in the Finger Lakes region during quiet moments between client projects. There was something appealing about those photos of lakeside cabins and hiking trails, places where nobody could find me or ask me for anything. I bookmarked several options, telling myself I was just looking. The breaking point came during a conversation with my best friend, Jenna Coleman. We'd known each other since college, bonded over late-night study sessions, and a shared love of terrible reality TV. After graduation, we'd maintained our friendship even as our lives took different paths. She'd become a yoga instructor, building a successful practice in Terrytown, while I'd started my design business. We were supposed to meet for dinner on a Wednesday evening in late November. I'd been looking forward to it all week, planning to tell her about therapy and maybe even admit how unhappy I'd been. But at 4:30 that afternoon, my phone rang. Victoria, emergency. Brad's showing fell through, and I have to stay late for this client presentation. Can you pick up the kids from after-school care? I'll owe you big time. I heard myself saying yes before I'd even processed the request. Then I called Jenna to cancel. When she picked up, her voice was strained in a way I'd never heard before. Let me guess, Stephanie needs something. The accuracy of her statement hit me like cold water. How did you know, Victoria? You've canceled on me 6 times this month because of your sister. 6 times. I've been keeping track because I couldn't believe it myself. I felt my stomach drop. That couldn't be right. 6 times seemed impossible. The Halloween thing, the weekend she needed you to watch the kids because Brad was sick, the Tuesday when she had a work dinner, the Friday when their babysitter canceled, last week when she needed help with Thanksgiving shopping, and now tonight. 6 times. Jenna's voice wasn't angry exactly, but it was firm in a way that made me pay attention. When's the last time Stephanie accommodated your schedule? When's the last time she changed her plans to help you with something? I opened my mouth to answer, then closed it again. I searched my memory going back months, then years. I couldn't think of a single instance when Stephanie had rearranged her life to make mine easier. I can't remember, I admitted quietly. That's the problem, Victoria. And until you can remember, this isn't going to change. After I picked up the kids and spent another evening as an unpaid babysitter, I sat in my car outside Stephanie's house and stared at my phone. Jenna was right, and somehow that made everything worse. I wasn't just enabling Stephanie's behavior, I was disappearing into it, becoming nothing more than a convenient solution to her inconveniences. Something had to change. The question was whether I had the courage to actually change it. December arrived with the crisp promise of snow and the familiar anxiety that always accompanied the holiday season in my family. By then, I'd been seeing Dr. Rodriguez for 3 months, and something fundamental had shifted inside me. The sessions had given me a vocabulary for what I was experiencing and, more importantly, the tools to recognize when it was happening. I promised myself that the next time Stephanie tried to steamroll over my boundaries, I would stand my ground. Christmas preparations at the Hayes household followed the same script they had for decades. Mom spent the better part of a week in the kitchen, preparing her signature dishes with the precision of a military operation. The honey-glazed ham that took 2 days to brine properly, scalloped potatoes layered with 3 different cheeses that she'd perfected, over 20 years of Christmas dinners. The green bean casserole topped with crispy onions that Dad claimed was better than any restaurant version. And always, the homemade apple pie with vanilla ice cream that she churned herself because store-bought just wasn't the same. I arrived at my parents' colonial house in Scarsdale at exactly 2 o'clock. On Christmas afternoon, my arms loaded with carefully wrapped presents that had taken me hours to select. The house looked like something from a holiday magazine, decorated with the kind of traditional elegance that Mom had cultivated over decades of hosting. The dining room table was set with her best china, the Waterford crystal that only emerged for special occasions, and centerpieces she'd crafted from pine branches and cranberries gathered from their own backyard. Christmas music drifted softly from the living room speakers, and the tree in the corner of the family room sparkled with ornaments that told the story of our family over the years. Handmade decorations I'd created in elementary school hung next to delicate glass baubles Mom had collected from various vacations. Each ornament had its own story, its own place in the careful choreography of our family traditions. The scene inside was exactly what I'd expected. Stephanie, Brad, and the kids had arrived before me, claiming the prime real estate in the family room. Stephanie had positioned herself in Mom's favorite armchair, the one with the perfect view of both the kitchen and the living room, scrolling through her phone with the sort of focused attention she usually reserved for work emails. She barely looked up when I walked in, offering a distracted wave that somehow managed to convey both acknowledgement and dismissal. Brad sat on the couch nearby, but his posture told a different story than the relaxed family gathering it was supposed to be. His shoulders were tense, and he kept checking his own phone with the sort of nervous energy that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. Even on Christmas work seemed to follow him. Or maybe he was using it as an escape from whatever tension was simmering beneath the surface. The kids, thankfully, were oblivious to the adult undercurrents. Chloe had set up some elaborate board game with Grandpa Bob, her 9-year-old intensity focused entirely on explaining rules that seemed to change every few minutes. Tyler was building something architectural out of couch cushions, while Lily toddled around in a red velvet dress that made her look like a tiny Christmas angel. Chloe spotted me first, abandoning her game mid-explanation to throw her arms around my waist. Tyler followed immediately, and soon I was engulfed in a group hug that included Lily's sticky hands and the kind of unconditional enthusiasm that only children can provide. "Aunt Victoria, you're here!" Chloe's voice held genuine excitement. "I brought my new art supplies to show you later. I've been practicing the color theory stuff you taught me." "That's wonderful, sweetheart." I managed to keep my voice steady despite the way my heart clenched. These moments with the kids were why Stephanie's manipulation worked so well. How could I protect my own boundaries when it meant disappointing people I loved so much? Dinner unfolded with its usual choreography. Dad carved the ham with surgical precision, his engineering background evident in the perfectly uniform slices. Mom bustled between the kitchen and dining room, fussing over whether the potatoes were too dry or if the green beans needed more salt. It was controlled chaos, the kind of organized holiday stress that somehow felt comforting despite its intensity. Stephanie dominated the conversation as usual, regaling us with stories about her recent promotion and the challenges of managing a larger team at Morrison and Associates. Brad occasionally interjected with updates about the kids' achievements, but his contributions felt forced, like he was reading from a script he'd memorized but didn't particularly believe in. I sat quietly, enjoying the familiar flavors of Mom's cooking and the chaotic warmth that defined our family gatherings. Despite everything, despite the patterns and the resentment and the therapy sessions spent unpacking decades of dysfunction, this was still my family. These people still mattered to me even when they drove me crazy. But during dessert, as Mom served her famous apple pie and the conversation turned to lighter topics, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Stephanie's expensive leather portfolio planner sat beside her plate. The kind of professional organizer that successful business people carried to important meetings. She'd placed it there deliberately, I realized, like a prop waiting for its moment in the performance. I'd seen this ritual before. Stephanie always brought her planner when she had announcements to make, especially announcements that somehow involved me. The leather portfolio was her way of lending official weight to whatever she was about to propose, as if having it written down in her fancy planner made it automatically legitimate. Brad's discomfort became more obvious as the meal progressed. He kept shifting in his chair, checking his phone, avoiding eye contact with both Stephanie and me. When he thought no one was looking, I caught him rubbing his temples in a gesture that spoke of headaches both literal and metaphorical. As if sensing my observation, Chloe leaned closer to me while the adults debated the merits of various pie crust techniques. Her voice dropped to a whisper that only I could hear. Mommy and Daddy have been fighting about money again, she said with the matter-of-fact tone that kids used when reporting on adult behavior they didn't fully understand. Daddy says we spend too much on stuff we don't need, but Mommy says he doesn't understand business expenses. My heart sank even further. Of course they were fighting about money. Of course there was some financial pressure that would somehow inevitably become my problem to solve. The planner wasn't just a prop. It was evidence of whatever expensive plans Stephanie was about to unveil, whatever commitment she'd made without consulting anyone else, whatever obligation she was about to transfer to me. I glanced around the table at my family, all of them blissfully unaware of the storm that was brewing. Mom was cutting second slices of pie for anyone who wanted them. Dad was telling some story about his golf game that had Tyler giggling. The Christmas music continued its gentle soundtrack to our family tradition, but I could feel it coming, the familiar sensation of being voluntary for something I hadn't agreed to do. The planner sat there like a loaded gun, waiting for Stephanie to pick it up and aim it in my direction. Whatever was written in those pages was going to change everything, and I had this sinking feeling that all my therapy sessions and boundary-setting exercises were about to be put to the ultimate test. Stephanie cleared her throat with the sort of theatrical precision that demanded everyone's attention. The casual family chatter died away as she reached for her leather portfolio planner, lifting it with the reverence of someone handling a sacred document. She placed it in the center of the table like a centerpiece, her movements deliberate and ceremonial. Brad and I have some exciting news, she announced, her voice taking on the polished tone she used for client presentations. Her smile was perfectly calibrated, the kind that looked genuine from a distance but didn't quite reach her eyes when you were sitting close enough to really see her. The portfolio opened with a soft leather whisper, revealing pages of meticulous organization that would have impressed a fortune. 500 CEO, detailed itineraries printed on crisp white paper, dates highlighted in different colors, typed schedules with precise timing, and colorful tabs marking different sections of what was clearly an elaborate plan. This wasn't just a vacation, this was a production. We've booked a cruise to the Bahamas for President's Day week, February 12th through 19th, 2024. 7 days and 6 nights on the Royal Caribbean Voyager of the Seas. Mom's hands flew together in delight. Oh, how wonderful. You two absolutely deserve a nice vacation. You work so hard all year. Dad raised his wine glass with a sort of paternal pride that had been Stephanie's soundtrack since childhood. Fantastic planning, sweetheart. You've always been so good at organizing these things. The praise rolled off Stephanie like she'd been expecting it, which she probably had. She basked in their approval for a moment before launching into a detailed description of their upcoming luxury getaway. Spa treatments that cost more than most people's monthly groceries. Fine dining at specialty restaurants with celebrity chefs. Excursions to 3 different islands with private beach access and guided tours. As she spoke, I noticed the way her eyes kept finding mine across the table. It wasn't casual. It was calculated, measuring my reaction to each expensive detail she described. She was building up to something, laying the groundwork for whatever was written in that planner, and the familiar sinking feeling in my stomach told me exactly where this was headed. Brad had gone completely silent, focused on his dessert plate with a sort of intense concentration usually reserved for complex mathematical equations. He wouldn't meet anyone's eyes, especially not mine, and his shoulders had the hunched quality of someone bracing for impact. The cruise departs February 12th. Stephanie continued, turning the planner around so I could see the pages she'd prepared. The dates were highlighted in bright yellow, with detailed departure information typed in neat columns. And there, in the margin beside the dates, written in Stephanie's careful handwriting, was my name. Not a question mark. Maybe not. Just Victoria, as if my participation had been decided long before this moment. So, Victoria, you'll watch the kids that week? We'll drop them off on the 11th, since we need to be at the port early the next morning. The words hit the table like stones thrown into still water. Not a question. Not a request for a favor. Not even a polite assumption disguised as a question. A statement. An expectation. An announcement of what my February schedule would look like, delivered with the casual confidence of someone who had never once been told. No. The table fell silent except for the soft Christmas music still playing in the background. All eyes turned to me like I was an actor who'd missed my cue. Mom looked hopeful, her face already lighting up with the assumption that of course I would say, yes. Dad's expression held that familiar expectation, the same look he'd worn throughout my childhood whenever Stephanie needed something and I was expected to provide it. Brad shifted uncomfortably in his chair, finally looking up from his plate, but still avoiding direct eye contact with anyone. The kids continued eating their pie, completely oblivious to the tension that had suddenly filled the room. Chloe was carefully separating her crust from her filling. Tyler was building a small sculpture out of his vanilla ice cream. And Lily was more interested in the pattern on her spoon than the adult conversation happening around her. I felt Dr. Rodriguez's voice in my head, as clear as if she were sitting beside me at the table. Your needs matter too, Victoria. You have the right to say no. You have the right to have your time respected. I took a deep breath, feeling something shift inside my chest. 3 months of therapy sessions, role-playing exercises, and boundary-setting practice had been leading to this moment. All those times I'd sat in Dr. Rodriguez's office and imagined standing up for myself. All those conversations where I'd practiced saying no without over-explaining or apologizing. This was my test. I can't do that, Stephanie. I have plans that week. The words came out steadier than I'd expected, but they landed like a grenade in the middle of our family Christmas dinner. Stephanie's fork clattered against her plate, the sharp sound cutting through the sudden silence. What plans? Her voice had lost all its earlier polish, replaced by something sharper and more familiar. You work from home. You can watch them while you work. It's not like you have a real schedule to maintain. There it was, the dismissal of my entire professional life, delivered with the sort of casual cruelty that Stephanie had perfected over the years. My work wasn't real work. My time wasn't valuable. My plans weren't important enough to interfere with her luxury vacation. But this time, instead of shrinking back or making excuses, I felt something I'd never experienced before in a family confrontation. I felt calm, clear, certain. I had commitments that week that can't be rescheduled, I said, my voice remaining steady despite the way my heart was hammering against my ribs. You should have asked me before booking the cruise. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Mom's hopeful expression flickered with confusion. Dad's wineglass paused halfway to his lips. Brad looked like he wanted to disappear entirely, probably wishing he'd stayed home with a convenient case of food poisoning. But Stephanie's reaction was the most telling of all. For just a moment, her carefully constructed mask slipped completely, revealing something raw and angry underneath. She wasn't used to hearing the word no from me. In 32 years of being sisters, I couldn't remember a single time I'd refused one of her requests. The Christmas music continued its cheerful soundtrack to our family implosion, and somewhere in the kitchen, the dishwasher hummed its steady rhythm. Normal sounds of a normal holiday. While everything I'd known about my place in this family started to crumble around the edges, I maintained my composure despite the way Stephanie was staring at me like I'd just announced I was joining a cult. I have client meetings scheduled and personal commitments that can't be rescheduled, I said, keeping my voice level. You should have asked me before booking the cruise instead of just assuming I'd be available. Stephanie's carefully constructed holiday mask finally dropped completely, revealing the raw frustration underneath. But we already paid for it. It's non-refundable. $4,200, Victoria. We can't just lose that money. There it was. The real reason for the dramatic planner presentation, the elaborate build-up, the assumption that I would automatically say yes. They'd booked an expensive vacation they couldn't afford to lose. And my free babysitting services were the linchpin that made the whole thing possible. Brad finally spoke up, his voice strained with the sort of careful diplomacy that suggested this wasn't the first time he'd found himself mediating between his wife and reality. Stephanie, maybe we should have checked with Victoria first before we booked everything. The look Stephanie shot him could have frozen the Bahamas. Stay out of this, Brad. This is between me and my sister. But Mom had already shifted into her familiar peacemaker role, the same soothing tone she'd used throughout our childhood whenever Stephanie wanted something and I showed any resistance. Surely you can rearrange your schedule, dear. I mean, they've already made all the arrangements. It's such a lovely opportunity for them to have some time together. Dad nodded in agreement, raising his wineglass as if the matter was already settled. The kids love staying with you, Victoria. They always have such a good time. That settles everything. I felt the familiar pressure closing in around me like a heavy blanket. The collective weight of their expectations, their assumptions, their complete inability to consider that I might have a life worth protecting. For 32 years, this had been the moment when I caved, when I swallowed my own needs and made everyone else comfortable. But something was different this time. As I looked around the table at their expectant faces, I remembered all the canceled plans, the rescheduled meetings, the dates that never happened because Stephanie needed something. I thought about Marcus, about the restaurant reservation I'd lost, about Jenna's frustrated voice when she'd pointed out how many times I'd canceled on her. "I'm sorry, but I can't do it this time," I said. And my voice came out stronger than I'd expected. "You need to find another solution." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the Christmas music seemed to pause, as if the universe itself was holding its breath to see what would happen next. Stephanie's face went through several shades of red before settling on something close to burgundy. "This is completely selfish, Victoria. After everything we've done for you, everything our family has done for you, this is how you repay us." The question hit me like cold water, mainly because I genuinely couldn't think of an answer. "What exactly have you done for me?" "Stephanie." The words came out before I could stop them, and they landed at the table like a live grenade. Everyone went completely still. Mom's hand froze halfway to her water glass. Dad's wine glass stopped moving toward his lips. Even the kids seemed to sense that something significant was happening, though they couldn't understand what. Stephanie sputtered for a moment, clearly not having expected to be challenged on what she considered an obvious truth. "We're family," she finally managed. "We include you in everything. We've always made you part of our lives." As soon as she said it, I realized how hollow those words actually were. Everything meant family gatherings where I helped with the kids while she and Brad socialized with other adults. Everything meant birthday parties where I was expected to bring gifts and clean up afterward. Everything meant holiday dinners where I contributed food and labor while she got credit for hosting. Being included in everything meant being useful to everything, not being valued by everything. "I'm not available that week," I said. And this time there was no apology in my voice. Period. Stephanie stood up so abruptly that her chair scraped against the hardwood floor with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. Her sudden movement knocked over her wine glass, sending red wine spreading across Mom's carefully set table like blood across a crime scene. "We'll discuss this tomorrow when you've had time to think rationally," she announced, her voice carrying the sort of dismissive authority she probably used with junior employees at Morrison and Associates. "When you've had time to remember what family actually means." Brad immediately reached for his napkin, quietly trying to soak up the wine while avoiding eye contact with everyone at the table. "I'm sorry about the glass," he murmured to Mom, his voice barely audible. "We'll replace the tablecloth." It was Chloe who broke the horrible tension with the sort of innocent question that only children can ask. "Why is Mommy mad at Aunt Victoria?" Her 9-year-old voice cut through the adult drama with devastating clarity. "Did Aunt Victoria do something bad?" The uncomfortable silence that followed was somehow worse than Stephanie's shouting. Nobody knew how to answer because nobody wanted to explain that Mommy was mad. Because Aunt Victoria had finally said no to something. Tyler looked confused, his 7-year-old brain trying to process why the adults were acting so strangely. Lily just continued eating her pie, blissfully unaware that she was witnessing the first real rebellion in Hayes' family history. I stood up slowly, my legs feeling unsteady, but my resolve surprisingly solid. "I need to go," I said, addressing the table generally, rather than any one person specifically. "Thank you for dinner, Mom. It was delicious as always." I gathered my purse and coat while the rest of my family sat in stunned silence. Stephanie was already putting on her own coat, her movements sharp and angry. Brad was still dabbing at the wine stain with increasing desperation. The kids were watching everything with the sort of wide-eyed attention that children reserved for moments when they sensed their world was shifting in ways they couldn't understand. The drive home was a blur of holiday lights and familiar streets that suddenly felt foreign. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles went white, and my heart was pounding with a mixture of guilt and indignation that made me feel slightly sick. I had just done something I'd never done before in my entire life. I had stood up to Stephanie in front of our entire family. I had said no and meant it, even when the pressure to give in had been overwhelming. But as I pulled into my driveway and sat in my car for a moment before going, inside I knew this was just the beginning. Stephanie wasn't going to accept my refusal gracefully. The battle I'd been avoiding for 32 years was finally about to begin. I hadn't thought far ahead when I'd said no at Christmas dinner, but I knew Stephanie well enough to understand that she wouldn't simply accept my refusal and move on. She'd never encountered real resistance from me before, and she wasn't going to start gracefully now. So when I got home that night, still shaky from the confrontation, I did something I'd never done before. I made a plan. I'd been bookmarking those Finger Lakes cabin rentals for weeks during my late-night research sessions, telling myself I was just looking. But now, sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop open and my heart still racing from dinner, I realized those weren't just idle daydreams. They were escape routes I'd been unconsciously preparing. I found the cabin I'd been drawn to most, a small place at Finger Lakes Resort about 3 hours north of the city. It had everything I needed: complete privacy, reliable internet for work, and most importantly, availability for the exact dates of Stephanie's cruise. February 11th through 18th, 2024. 7 days of peace while my sister learned what it actually meant to be responsible for her own children. The non-refundable rate was $800, more than I usually spent on myself in 3 months. But as I entered my credit card information, I realized that the non-refundable part wasn't a drawback. It was insurance against my own tendency to cave under pressure. Once I clicked submit, there would be no backing down, no last-minute guilt trips that could make me change my mind. The confirmation email felt like a victory and a declaration of war all at once. Next, I scrolled through my business emails until I found the inquiry I'd received in November from Eastside Restaurant Group. They'd expressed interest in a complete rebranding project for their chain of family restaurants throughout the Hudson Valley. I'd been meaning to follow up, but between Stephanie's constant demands and the holiday rush, I'd let it slide. Now it felt like perfect timing. I crafted a professional email suggesting a major consultation meeting for February 14th, Valentine's Day. The irony wasn't lost on me that while Stephanie was expecting me to sacrifice my week for her romantic getaway, I'd be building my actual career instead. The potential contract was worth $15,000, more than I usually made in 3 months. If I landed it, this one meeting would prove that my work wasn't just a hobby, that my time had real financial value, that my family had been dismissing for years. With the cabin booked and the meeting scheduled, I sat down to write the note that would make my position crystal clear. I kept it simple, professional, and completely unambiguous. Stephanie and Brad, I am unavailable to watch the children during your cruise. As I mentioned at Christmas dinner, I have prior commitments that cannot be changed. Please respect my decision and make alternative arrangements. I hope you enjoy your vacation, Victoria. I printed it out, slipped it into a plastic sheet protector, and set it by my front door. When the time came, I would tape it where they couldn't miss it. The next afternoon, my phone rang. No pleasantries, no "how are you doing?" Just Stephanie's voice sharp with irritation. "Have you come to your senses yet?" My answer is still no. I replied, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. I have commitments that week that I cannot break. What commitments? Her voice rose an octave. You never do anything important. You sit in your garage all day, making pretty pictures for people who probably won't even remember your name next year. The cruelty of it took my breath away for a moment. This was my sister, someone who was supposed to love me, reducing my entire professional life to pretty pictures made for forgettable people. But instead of shrinking back like I usually did, I felt something harden inside my chest. My time is valuable to me, I said quietly. I have work meetings and personal plans that matter to me, even if they don't matter to you. This is completely selfish, Victoria. After everything our family has done for you, after all the ways we've included you and supported you, this is how you repay us. The same argument she'd made at dinner, delivered with even more venom, but this time I was ready for it. What exactly have you done for me, Stephanie? The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost some of its certainty. We're family. That's not how this works. The family doesn't keep score. But even as she said it, I could hear something in the background that made me pause. Another voicemail saying something I couldn't quite make out. Then Stephanie's voice muffled as if she'd covered the phone, but still audible. Brad, stay out of this. His response was clearer, probably because he was getting louder. Maybe she has a point, Stephanie. We never actually asked her. We just assumed. Whose side are you on? Stephanie's voice was sharp with the kind of anger that suggested this wasn't their first fight about this topic. I'm on the side of not taking people for granted, Brad said. And even through the muffled phone connection, I could hear the frustration that had probably been building for months. Stephanie came back on the line, her voice tight with barely controlled fury. We'll discuss this later when you've had time to think about what you're really saying no to. I know exactly what I'm saying no to, I replied. I'm saying no to being taken for granted. I'm saying no to being treated like I don't have a life worth respecting. And I'm saying no to canceling my plans for people who wouldn't do the same. For me, fine. But don't come crying to us when you realize what you've thrown away. She hung up before I could respond, leaving me staring at my phone and wondering what exactly I was supposed to have thrown away. A lifetime of being everyone's backup plan. A family role that required me to be perpetually available and grateful for the privilege. For the first time since Christmas dinner, I felt something close to relief. The battle lines were drawn, the cabin was booked, and the meeting was scheduled. Stephanie could rage all she wanted, but I was finally done being her solution to every inconvenience. The only question now was whether I'd have the courage to see it through when February arrived and they showed up at my door with their luggage and their expectations. I ended the call before Stephanie could launch into another lecture about family obligations, my hands shaking but my mind surprisingly clear. Within minutes, my phone lit up like a Christmas tree. First came a text, "Stephanie's stressed about work stuff. Maybe we can figure something out that works for everyone." Then Mom's voice, pleading through a voicemail that made my chest tight with familiar guilt. "Sweetheart, I just talked to Stephanie. She's very upset. Maybe you could reconsider. You know how important this trip is to them. They've been planning it for months." Dad's message came last, delivered in the stern tone he'd perfected during my teenage years. "Victoria, this behavior is completely unacceptable. Your sister needs your help, and family comes first. Call me back so we can discuss this like adults." I silenced my phone and placed it face down on my kitchen counter, but I could still feel it buzzing against the granite like an angry insect. That evening, I called Dr. Rodriguez for an emergency session. She listened without judgment as I recounted the Christmas dinner, confrontation, and the phone calls that followed. "You should be proud of yourself, Victoria," she said when I finished. "Setting boundaries is incredibly difficult, especially when those boundaries have never existed before. Your family is experiencing what we call an extinction burst. They're escalating their pressure because the old methods aren't working anymore. But what if I'm being selfish? The doubt had been eating at me all day. What if I should just help them this one time? They already paid for the cruise. Maybe I'm making too big a deal out of this, Dr. Rodriguez's response was gentle but firm. Is it selfish to expect basic respect? Is it selfish to want your time and plans to be considered valuable? You're not asking them to sacrifice anything for you. You're simply asking them to respect the word no. By the time I hung up, I felt centered again. But the family phone tree had been working overtime, and the pressure campaign was just beginning. Aunt Susan sent a scathing email that landed in my inbox like a guided missile. "Victoria, I'm extremely disappointed in your behavior. Stephanie has always been such a loving sister, and this is how you repay her. Family obligations don't disappear just because they're inconvenient. You should be ashamed of yourself." Uncle Michael called while I was eating dinner, his construction foreman voice booming through the speaker. "Victoria, what's this? I hear about you abandoning your sister. You need to show some respect for your elders and stop being so selfish. Stephanie's older than you, and when she needs something, you help. That's how families work." The fact that he was treating Stephanie like she had parental authority over me would have been funny if it weren't so revealing about how my family actually saw our relationship. But then came a text that surprised me completely. It was from Amy Clark, my cousin David's wife, an elementary school teacher I'd always liked but rarely talked to outside of family gatherings. "Good for you, Victoria. Stephanie's been taking advantage of everyone for years. Someone finally had the courage to say no. Don't let them guilt you into backing down." That single message of support meant more than I could express. It was the first indication that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the crazy one in this situation. Meanwhile, something unexpected was happening with Mom. She called her sister Margaret in Florida, something she only did when she was genuinely troubled about something. I knew this because Margaret called me the next day. "Your mother's been doing some thinking about family patterns," Margaret said without preamble. She asked me some hard questions about how she raised you girls. I told her what I've been wanting to say for years. "She's always made excuses for Stephanie while expecting you to accommodate everyone else." When I talked to Mom later that week, she sounded different. Uncertain in a way that was completely unlike her usual confident maternal authority. "I've been reading some articles about family dynamics," she admitted quietly. "Maybe we haven't been as fair to you as we should have been." It wasn't a full apology, but it was acknowledgement, which was more than I'd ever received before. I strengthened my resolve through daily meditation and journaling, practices Dr. Rodriguez had taught me to manage anxiety. I arranged for my neighbor Mrs. Chen to collect my mail and water my plants during my retreat. I packed my suitcase with warm clothes and good books. I loaded my car with groceries and supplies for a week of complete independence. I also scheduled additional client video calls for the week I'd be at the cabin, building a schedule that would prove my work was both valuable and time-sensitive. But as February approached, the pressure intensified dramatically. February 10th brought a barrage of increasingly desperate messages. Stephanie sent passive-aggressive texts about how disappointed the children would be, how they'd been looking forward to staying with their favorite aunt, how she didn't know how to explain to them that Aunt Victoria didn't want to spend time with them anymore. Mom mentioned her back problems in a carefully casual voicemail, noting how difficult it would be for her to chase after 3 energetic children for a whole week, especially with her recent physical therapy appointments. Dad sent a formal text that read like a legal document. Victoria, your continued refusal to help your sister is damaging our family relationships. I hope you'll reconsider before it's too late to repair the harm you're causing. Through it all, I maintained radio silence. Every instinct screamed at me to call them back to explain myself, to make them understand that I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. But Dr. Rodriguez had been clear about this. Engaging with the pressure campaign would only escalate it. The only way through was to stay consistent with my boundary. On February 10th, I went to bed early, setting my alarm for dawn. Tomorrow they would learn that I'd meant exactly what I said. The thought terrified and exhilarated me in equal measure. For the first time in my life, I was about to prove that my word actually meant something. The Friday after conferences left me hollowed out. Parents lined up outside my classroom from morning until evening, each one bringing their fears, frustrations, and questions that I could only partly answer. I did my best, but by the time the last mother thanked me and left, my head throbbed. I sat at my desk staring at the messy pile of notes, feeling the weight of everything my students carried on their small shoulders. Their hunger, their struggles, their loneliness. I carried it too, whether I wanted to or not. A colleague, Lily, poked her head in and said we deserved something nice. Something beyond the cafeteria leftovers we usually settled for. She suggested Lumiere, the French restaurant downtown that was famous in Boston, the kind of place people saved for anniversaries. I almost said no. My bank account was tight, and Beacon Hill glitter still made me uncomfortable. But I was too tired to fight, and a small part of me wanted to step into a world that reminded me of my family, even if it only deepened the ache. The cab pulled up to the entrance, and my chest tightened. Gold lettering shimmered against the glass doors, chandeliers glowing through tall windows, men in tailored suits laughing in the lobby. It was the kind of place where my father thrived, where my mother paraded, where Samantha would glide in and expect to be noticed. I felt like an intruder in my plain dress and scuffed shoes. We were led to a corner table with a view of the city skyline. I pressed my hands into my lap, pretending to admire the chandeliers, so I would not focus on how out of place. I felt that was when he appeared. Good evening, ladies. My name is Michael, and I'll be your server tonight. I looked up and saw him standing there, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at the edges, but it was his eyes that stopped me. Brown, steady, calm, with a quiet intensity that made me feel as if he was speaking to me alone. Even though he addressed the whole table, his voice had no trace of the rehearsed charm I had heard from servers in expensive restaurants. It was natural, grounded, like he had nothing to prove. When he handed me the menu, our fingers brushed. It was a simple touch, accidental, but it jolted me like a spark in dry air. I pulled back quickly, forcing a polite smile, hoping no one noticed the heat creeping up my neck. Is this your first time here? He asked. Yes, I said, my throat dry. Any recommendations? Instead of rattling off specials, he began to speak of food like a storyteller. He described the saffron in the bouillabaisse, the cherry reduction with the duck confit, how each ingredient balanced the other. He talked about textures and flavors with a reverence that made me forget I was listening to a waiter. His words painted pictures, his tone almost intimate. And then he looked at me directly. For you, I would recommend the duck confit. It has a richness balanced by something bright. Something tells me you might appreciate nuance. The table chuckled, my colleagues exchanging glances, but I couldn't find the words to answer. My cheeks burned. I nodded silently, as though I had just been handed a secret. The meal passed in a blur. He refilled glasses, offered bread, made subtle jokes that drew laughs without stealing attention. I should have been focused on the food, but every time he returned to our table, I felt the air shift. When we left, I found myself glancing back, watching him disappear behind the curtain into the kitchen. That night, walking home through the cool Boston air, I felt restless. It wasn't just that he was attractive. It was the way he carried himself, the way he seemed untouched by the arrogance of the world he worked in. It unsettled me. The following week, I told myself it was ridiculous, but I returned. I chose a table alone near the window and asked for Michael's section, my voice too quick, my pulse betraying me. When he arrived, that same steady smile crossed his face, and I felt both relieved and exposed. He remembered me. He asked about my week, and when I mentioned a student struggling with reading, he asked follow-up questions, genuine ones, not the polite nodding I had grown used to from people in my family circles. How did he do on his spelling test? Michael asked, as if it mattered to him. Better, I said, blinking at how closely he had listened. You remembered. Of course, he replied easily. Details are important. Our conversation drifted to books to art. He spoke about an exhibition at a warehouse downtown, about brushstrokes and colors with knowledge that surprised me. He talked about a novel he had just finished, and I caught myself leaning forward, drawn in by his quiet passion. It became a pattern. I visited Lumiere more often than my budget allowed, sometimes with Lily, often by myself. Each time Michael treated me with the same attentive respect, never overstepping, never flirting too openly, but always with an undercurrent I could feel. Every time our hands brushed when he handed me a menu or cleared a plate, something inside me stirred a warmth I hadn't felt in years. There was one night late, when the restaurant had thinned out and I lingered over dessert, reluctant to leave. Michael stopped at my table, resting one hand lightly on the back of a chair. "You look like you needed tonight," he said softly. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "I did. It's been a long week." He nodded. "Teaching is not easy work, but it matters more than most people realize." I stared at him, struck by the way his words cut through me. My father had called it a waste, my mother a mistake, my sister a joke. And here was a man I barely knew telling me it mattered. The contrast made my chest ache. When I reached for the bill, our fingers touched again, lingering just a moment longer than before. His eyes flicked to mine, steady, almost searching, and I felt the world narrow to just the two of us. I walked out into the Boston night with my pulse racing, the city lights blurring. I told myself it was harmless, just a crush, just a distraction. But deep down, I knew it was more. Something had shifted. Michael Evans was not just a waiter who happened to be kind. He had unsettled something buried inside me, something that had been starved for far too long. And as much as I tried to resist it, I knew I would be back. I ended the call and immediately blocked both Stephanie's and Brad's numbers, at least temporarily. I needed space to think clearly and drive safely without my phone buzzing. Every 30 seconds, with increasingly frantic attempts to wear down my resolve. It didn't take long for the backup cavalry to arrive. Within minutes, my parents started calling. Dad's voicemail was stern and commanding, delivered in the tone he'd used when I was 16 and had broken curfew. "Victoria, call me back immediately. Your sister is very upset, and this whole situation has gotten completely out of hand. You need to fix this right now." Mom's message came next, dripping with the kind of guilt that had been her most effective parenting tool throughout my childhood. "Sweetheart, please reconsider what you're doing. The children are crying, and they don't understand why Aunt Victoria doesn't want to spend time with them. Is that really what you wanted? To break their little hearts?" The manipulation was so practiced, so automatic, that I almost admired its efficiency. But after months of therapy, I could see it for what it was. They weren't worried about the children's hearts. They were worried about their own inconvenience. I sent the same text message to both of them, keeping it simple and factual. "I'm going on a planned vacation. Stephanie and Brad knew I was unavailable and chose to ignore me. I will call when I return next week." By the time I switched my phone to airplane mode, the social media storm had already begun. Aunt Susan had posted on Facebook about selfish family members who abandoned their responsibilities when people needed them most. Uncle Michael had commented on one of my old photos about people who had their priorities completely wrong. The family network was mobilizing exactly as I'd expected. But there were surprises, too. Cousin David sent a private message asking what was really going on, suggesting he'd heard multiple versions of the story and wasn't sure who to believe. And Amy Clark, his wife, sent a direct message that made me smile despite everything. "Stand your ground, Victoria." This was long overdue. Stephanie's been pulling this stuff with everyone for years. I locked my front door, grabbed my suitcase and car keys, and walked out the back door to where I'd parked my car in the garage. As I backed out of my driveway, I caught a glimpse of Stephanie's silver SUV still parked across the street. Through her windshield, I could see her pacing in tight circles beside the vehicle, her phone pressed to her ear with the desperate energy of someone trying to solve an impossible puzzle. Brad sat in the passenger seat holding Lily, who was still crying with the heartbroken wails of a confused 4-year-old. Chloe had her arm around Tyler in the back seat, trying to comfort her younger brother who clearly didn't understand why their adventure had suddenly turned into a crisis. The image almost broke my resolve. These children didn't deserve to be caught in the middle of their parents' poor planning and my newfound backbone, but giving in now wouldn't protect them from future disappointments. It would only teach them that manipulation worked, that boundaries were negotiable, that the adults in their lives couldn't be trusted to mean what they said. Over the next few hours, as I drove north toward the Finger Lakes, the full scope of the consequences began to unfold through the text messages. that loaded when I briefly turned my phone back on at a rest stop. My parents had ultimately canceled their own plans to step in as emergency childcare. Mom's book club meeting, where she'd been scheduled to lead a discussion about their current novel. Dad's charity golf tournament, something he'd been looking forward to for weeks. Once again, other people's lives were being rearranged to accommodate Stephanie's assumptions and poor planning. If they tried to hire professional childcare, the cost would have been astronomical. $25 per hour for around-the-clock care times, 6 days, came to over $3,600. And that was assuming they could even find someone willing to take on 3 children for a full week with less than 24 hours notice. Stephanie and Brad were facing an impossible choice: cancel their $4,200 cruise and lose everything, or somehow find a way to make their childcare crisis work. But perhaps the most telling development was what I overheard during one brief phone call before I blocked their numbers. Brad was talking to someone, probably his mother, and his voice carried clearly through the phone. This is exactly what Victoria was talking about. We never actually asked her. We just assumed she'd say yes, like she always does. Stephanie's response was sharp and immediate. Whose side are you on? Brad, she's your sister-in-law, not your therapist. Even their marriage was cracking under the pressure. I later learned they'd moved up their marriage counseling appointment, something that had apparently been on the books for weeks, but suddenly felt urgent. Stephanie's social media presence told its own story. She posted a passive-aggressive status update that read, "When family lets you down at the worst possible moment, you learn who really cares about you." The responses were mixed. Some family members offered sympathy and support. Others, particularly friends who knew more of the story, asked pointed questions about what had actually happened. But the most validating message of all came from an unexpected source. Eastside Restaurant Group had responded to my email about the February 14th consultation with enthusiasm that bordered on excitement. They'd been impressed by my portfolio and were eager to discuss what they called a comprehensive rebranding partnership that could extend well beyond their initial inquiry. The potential value of the contract had grown from $15,000 to something that could sustain my business for months, while my family was treating my work like a hobby that could be abandoned whenever they needed something. Actual professionals were recognizing its value and wanting to invest in it. As I drove through the increasingly rural landscape toward my cabin retreat, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: pride in my own worth, confidence in my decisions, the certainty that I was finally walking toward a life that belonged entirely to me. Behind me, Stephanie and Brad were learning what it actually meant to be responsible for their own choices. Ahead of me lay a week of peace professional growth and the revolutionary experience of prioritizing my own needs without apology. For the first time in my adult life, I was about to discover what it felt like to be unavailable when someone else wanted something from me. The Finger Lakes cabin exceeded every expectation I'd built up during those late-night browsing sessions. Nestled among snow-covered pines with pristine lake views, it offered the perfect combination of rustic charm and modern comfort. A massive stone fireplace dominated the main room. The well-equipped kitchen had everything I needed for a week of solitude, and the king-sized bed was covered with a handmade quilt that looked like it had been crafted by someone who understood the value of slow, careful work. The windows overlooking the frozen pond framed a view so peaceful it felt like a painting. For the first 24 hours, I kept my phone completely off. I hiked the beginner trails that wound through the pine forest, built fires using the wood stacked neatly on the porch, and read half of a novel I'd abandoned months ago when Stephanie's latest crisis had demanded my attention. The silence was healing in a way I hadn't anticipated. Nothing but bird calls and the soft creaking of branches heavy with snow. No demands, no emergencies, no guilt trips disguised as family obligations. On day 2, curiosity finally won. I turned my phone back on, bracing myself for the inevitable deluge. Over 85 messages and 40 missed calls awaited me. I scrolled through them, noting the predictable pattern: initial anger, escalating panic, reluctant problem-solving, and finally resentful acceptance. The revelations that unfolded painted a picture I'd expected but still found shocking in its clarity. My parents had ultimately stepped in to watch the children, canceling their own long-standing commitments without a second thought. Mom missed her book club presidency meeting, where she'd been scheduled to lead a discussion she'd prepared for weeks. Dad forfeited his charity golf tournament, something he'd been looking forward to all winter. The double standard was glaring and undeniable. Their plans could be sacrificed at a moment's notice for Stephanie's convenience, but my boundary was treated like an act of family treason. the most revealing message came from Patricia Morrison, Brad's mother. I had to take kids Wednesday through Friday. Stephanie and Brad fight the entire cruise, cutting the trip short. Coming home tomorrow instead of Sunday. Lost $4,200 plus $800 in early flight fees. Family meeting Sunday at 2 p.m. Be there? Even their romantic getaway had imploded under the weight of their poor planning and mutual resentment. They'd lost over $5,000 because they couldn't handle the consequences of their own assumptions. But while my family's world was falling apart, mine, the February 14th video consultation with Eastside Restaurant Group, exceeded all my expectations. The client was impressed not just by my portfolio, but by my professional setup and the serene mountain backdrop visible through my cabin window. By the end of our 2-hour call, I'd secured a $15,000 rebranding contract that would sustain my business for months. During my supposedly irresponsible week of unavailability, I'd proven that my work had real value and that my time was worth protecting. I also began posting carefully curated updates on Instagram. Beautiful cabin scenery, my professional video call setup, cozy evening shots with wine by the fireplace, photos from my hiking adventures. For the first time, my family was seeing evidence of the rich, fulfilling life I'd built for myself. The life they'd been ignoring while treating me like their personal problem solver. The comments poured in from friends and acquaintances. So jealous of your retreat. You deserve this break. Living your best life. People who actually knew me as a person, rather than just a convenient babysitter, could see what my family had been blind to for years. Even more surprising was the ripple effect within my own family. Mom texted me midweek with something I'd never expected to receive. I've been reading a book about family boundaries, and I've scheduled an appointment with a therapist. I've been thinking about our family patterns, and we need to talk when you're ready. It was the first acknowledgement of her enabling behavior I'd ever received, and it meant more than she probably realized. Extended family members who saw my posts began reaching out privately. Cousin Amy commented supportively on every photo. Even Uncle Michael's wife sent a message that stunned me. Good for you for standing up for yourself. Someone needed to say no to them eventually. According to Patricia Morrison's updates, the marriage counseling session Brad had insisted on was revealing uncomfortable truths. Their therapist had identified what she called their delegation pattern, the way they consistently assumed other people would handle their responsibilities. Stephanie was resistant to the feedback, but Brad was pushing for real change. By my final morning at the cabin, I felt transformed in ways that went deeper than just having rested and recharged. For the first time in my adult life, I'd prioritized my own needs without apology and discovered that the world didn't end. I'd proven to myself and everyone else that my work had value, my time mattered, and my boundaries deserved respect. I checked out early Sunday morning and drove south toward my parents' house, where a family meeting awaited that would either mark the beginning of healthier relationships or the end of some unhealthy ones. Either outcome felt like progress. I arrived at exactly 2 o'clock punctual but not early. Stephanie's car was already there, along with Brad's truck and even Patricia Morrison's sedan. The full tribunal had assembled. I parked calmly, gathered the strength I'd built over a week of self-care, and walked toward the house, knowing I was no longer the same person who'd left 7 days earlier. Whatever happened in that meeting, I would face it as someone who finally understood her own worth. And that knowledge felt like the most valuable thing I'd ever possessed. Have you ever had to set boundaries with family members who took your time for granted? How did you find the courage to stand up for yourself? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might inspire someone else who needs to hear they're not alone. And if this story resonated with you, hit that subscribe button for more tales about finding your voice and reclaiming your worth. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply say no and mean it. 6 months later, I sat in my newly expanded studio space, reviewing contracts for 3 major clients I'd landed since that February breakthrough. The Eastside Restaurant Group project had led to referrals that transformed my business from survival mode to genuine success. My annual income had jumped to $90,000, and for the first time, I was turning down projects rather than desperately chasing them. The family dynamics had shifted in ways both subtle and profound. Stephanie still struggled with boundaries, but Brad had become an unexpected ally after their marriage counseling, revealed how his own enablement had contributed to their problems. When they planned their makeup cruise in August, they asked me 6 weeks in advance and gracefully accepted when I declined to take on a new wedding photography client instead. Mom had finished 3 books on family dynamics and started seeing Dr. Rodriguez herself. The change in her was remarkable. She'd learned to say no to her own volunteer commitments when they overwhelmed, her modeling the boundary setting she'd never taught us as children. The kids adapted faster than the adults. Chloe, now 10, had started asking permission before assuming I'd help with school projects. Tyler had learned that emergencies required actual emergencies, not just poor planning. And Lily, still delightfully dramatic at 5, had proclaimed that Aunt Victoria was the coolest because she went on adventures by herself. Christmas dinner this year felt different, lighter somehow. Stephanie brought her planner, but this time it contained questions instead of announcements. The leather portfolio that had once represented her control over my time had become a tool for actual family planning. The best part was discovering that standing up for myself hadn't destroyed our relationships. It had simply made them honest for the first time in 33 years. And that honesty, though sometimes uncomfortable, had created space for something I'd never experienced before, a family that actually respected who I was instead of just what I could do for them.